This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
So that's where Wizards of the Coast needs to take a more active, level-headed approach.
I think if your players aren't jerks, they will have a sort of respect. You ever heard of these guys?
Stop making things up, James. Stop making things up. You're just...
This is exactly what I get invited to speak for the history department about mythology.
And they keep inviting you back?
Bureaucracy, nepotition.
Or you could play a dwarf, which was a dwarf.
A flight of dragons!
I get people now tweeting me Geralt's feet.
I have no idea what anyone is talking about, what anyone is thinking. I don't even know what I'm thinking at this point.
All that and more right now.
3, 2, 1. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the Lorecast which is flavored original this week with our original lineup, the number one Eldritch Lorecast and podcast in all the realms. I'm falling apart. It's the end of the year. Let's just dive into this thing. My name's Ben Byrne. I'm here, as always, with Shawn Merwin, James Hake, Dael Kingsmill, and Dael. Speaking of Cosmic Postman, I actually have a question from them that they sent through, which is, all right, so liches have their skeleton hordes, yeah?
Okay.
Fae queens have their army of treants and fae.
Sure.
I'm trying to think of other common, like minions. Anyway, the question is, what is Dael Kingsmill's minions that you are sending out from your dark throne?
I'm sending out, you know what it is. It's not a large collection, but it is steadily growing of slightly frightening toys. So probably something like that. Like I've got a creepy little bear that I call Teddy Bear Bundy. And I've got, the gentleman, obviously. Mm-hmm. So I've got my creepy little guys. They're probably my minions.
That's just the worst horror movie. It's just Annabelle or Chucky, but there's lots of them. Got it.
Yeah.
James Hake, what are your minions? Don't say minions. Just as I've said that.
A horde of dragons at my command. Creatures whose wings stretch so far into the sky that they blot out all light. Colors of death spreading from their mouths, scorching all that comes before them. And also they're on the top of my little shelf, right up there, right in the corner there. Can
James,
you see
have you
them
ever seen Flight of Dragons?
My little guys. I can't say I have.
The bad guy in that, Omadon, ends up, he brainwashes the dragons, and so he has this army of dragons, and he does a speech very similar to the one that you did, except it's complete with, "A flight of dragons!" It's great. And then he just goes, "Doom, doom, doom." It's honestly incredible.
With the new D&D movie coming soon in the new year, I just want to encourage everyone to go rewatch the terrible one from the year 2000, where you have Jeremy Irons in full villain regalia, just like trembling, like all a quiver atop a tower, going, "Let their blood rain from the sky."
Incredible villain
brings
speech.
Dragons into the world.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. He kind of has that shtick in Watchmen as well. I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago. I was watching that, and that just seems like Jeremy Irons' shtick is like...
Man's got to get a paycheck.
Yeah. Sort of doughy, deep vocals that just kind of loose the lip. "Oh, I am Jeremy Irons, and bad
What I
stuff
like
is
about
happening."
it is that the bad guy I was talking about is voiced by James L. Jones. So it's the meeting of Mufasa and Scar once again.
The slick Jeremy Irons. Speaking of slick Jeremy Irons, Shawn Merwin, what is your army of minions?
Did you ever hear the tale of the cobbler who would go to sleep and the little elves would come in and do all his work?
Fairy tale.
My minions are like that, only they're like grumpy little old men who, when I go to sleep, they'll like come out and then clean my desk. But when they clean my desk, they just move things around rather than actually cleaning or doing any work. They just sort of rearrange things. So they're working, but they're really not getting anything done. So when I wake up, it's just everything's moved, but I still need to do all the work that I had to when I went to sleep.
I enjoy that. I think if I was to have minions, to be honest, maybe this is not quite minions, but I think I would be a sort of predictable Vesemir type character who my minions are my student witchers. that I send out into the world to slay monsters.
Which you watch.
Which you watch. Get it in early this week.
Early and often.
Yeah. I get people now tweeting me Geralt's feet on Twitter. It's great. It's incredible.
You brought this on yourself.
I did. Speaking of things that we all brought on ourselves, because there was a Kickstarter originally around it. The Legends of Vox Machina jumping into the news this week.
Woo-hoo.
Season 2 trailer has gone live about a couple of days ago on YouTube. I meant to watch it again before we went live and then I completely forgot, but I have seen it. Has anybody else seen the trailer? Have we got any strong feelings about this?
I feel much like I felt about the original season of Legends of Vox Machina, where it started a little rough, and then it really wowed me at the end. That was my arc through the season. That was my arc through this trailer. And I imagine, I'm hoping that it keeps the level of quality that we saw at the end of season 1 and pulls the same act again, because we're going to get something really great if it does that.
Are you looking forward to seeing the Chroma Conclave arc specifically? It definitely had, like, if season 1 was ultimately kind of gothic horror, which it leaned into, this seems a lot more epic fantasy. Like, we're fighting dragons, the world is ending. This is not an intimate little, well, as much as it was, an intimate little sort of family story anymore of revenge. This is a global scale disaster kind of story that they appear to be watching. And I didn't watch the Chroma Conclave arc on the original Critical Role. I only know of it in spoken whispers.
The Chroma Conclave arc is my favorite arc of Critical Role across all campaigns. Absolutely. It's the arc that I saw from the beginning when I was first watching, and I saw all the way through to the end. It's the arc that had all the guest stars that I loved, and all of the great sort of moments that people talk about. In my opinion, all the best ones come from that arc. So when it comes to translating to animation, I have no doubt that they're going to really capture it well, because it's full of great moments that are great for big, set piece animation bits. The thing that they need to do really well in order to sell me is to animate the dragons in a cool way. This is inside baseball a little bit. It's like, okay, so Matt Mercer is really inspired by like 80s and 90s anime, right? He loves 80s and 90s anime. And back in that era of animation, when it came to animating Western style dragons, they would really lean into limited animation, right? Anime is for TV is limited animation, but anime kind of pioneered a technique of making really gorgeous looking shots that move as little as possible, using either minor moving elements or camera work to make it look action filled. And so often when a dragon shows up, something like that, it will be hand painted gorgeously. And like maybe its mouth will move a little bit. Maybe like in the case of like Dragon Ball Z, like its tail will kind of swirl around it behind while the rest of it stays static. I don't want to see any of that in this. Like, I think that's cool. But with a show like Critical Role, they need to be showing us the awesome acrobatics and intense sort of like motion. You need to see the muscles of the dragon do their things. They tear down a tower. Like that's the thing that shows off the power in my mind. And I'm like a little bit worried that because of that love of that sort of classic era of animation, we're going to get a lot of that. But from the trailer we've seen so far, things are looking good.
The thing that stands out for me, right, is that watching the trailer, I felt a little bit like, oh no, where's all of that like dread that came from the very beginning of the Chroma Conclave arc, right? Because it starts with such an explosive boom, here are dragons, everything's suddenly on fire. And I wonder whether I'm just going to have to rewatch season 1 in the lead up in order to recreate that feeling, because watching the original run live, it was, story heavy first arc, really story heavy second arc. And then you hit the Chroma Conclave and it's this huge explosive opening, like I said, which really sets the tone. And then after that, very episodic. So the pacing is a little bit interesting. And in the live show, we got, weeks and weeks and weeks of time to really spend on it. It felt like a lot of time was passing as they went and spoiler alert, I don't know, collected the vestiges of Divergence. But, when you've got a limited number of episodes for an animated series, I wonder how you approach the pacing of that, because it's a lot of different stories happening to make that arc work and to make it come together for a satisfying conclusion that kind of matches the opening. So it will be interesting to see how they tackle the pacing.
Well, Pyrotechnic says the episode list for season 2 is posted already. What I'm curious to know is how many episodes that is, because it's on IMDb if folks want to go have a look. But spoiler, beware if you are sensitive to that sort of thing. Although, as Dael kind of alluded to a moment ago, this has been known storytelling for about 5 years now or longer. So, because I wondered that as well. Like, the Chroma Conclave does seem like an epic story arc. Because what, season 2 is something like 200 episodes or 150 episodes, something like that of the live play. And the Chroma Conclave is like the majority of that, isn't it? Before it gets into kind of the Vecna arc at the back end. It's like up to episode 35, 40, I want to say, is Briarwoods. And then it's Chroma Conclave after that, which kind of dominates most of the back end up to like episode 100. I don't know. I could be completely wrong. These are there should be question marks at the end of these statements. I'm hoping someone will rescue me, but alack.
The Chroma Conclave arc is definitely the biggest arc of the whole story, and the final arc, the Whispered One arc, doesn't kick in until there's a time skip, and then kind of around episode 100, they kick into that whole sort of gods and mortals tier of the campaign. Chroma Conclave is huge. If they condense all of it into season 2, and I haven't looked at that IMDb list, so I don't know yet. If they condense it all into season 2, it's either going to be a long season, or we're gonna lose a lot of the meandering space that Dael was talking about.
So I've looked it up. I've pulled up the episodes. There are 12 episodes in season 2. It seems to go through. It includes the Trials of Vasselheim, which is interesting because I think.
Oh my god.
I know. I know.
Condensing things. What?
I mean, there's some important stuff that happens in the Trials of Vasselheim, I suppose, in terms of it setting up the Rakshasa and some Vaxkila stuff. I'm trying. I don't know how much
Zara
I can step
Cash.
on. Yeah, exactly. Zara and Cash. I like the Trials of Vasselheim. I'm excited to see it. But it is also one of those things that maybe would have been first on my chopping block. We got The Sunken Tomb. We've got Pass Through Fire. We've got people who've watched it already are going to know what these things mean. So I feel like I'm in the clear for not spoiling things. They've got the Fey Realm. They've got the Kill Box, Belly of the Beast. And the last episode of the season is called The Hope Devourer. So.
Oh, okay. Then this is. I won't say anything else.
Yeah. That was going to be my question. My question was going to be, do you suspect this means that the Chroma Conclave arc might be split between season 2 and 3?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Which I think is a good idea for this particular arc. I think it's a very good idea.
Yeah, and where they're ending on The Hope Devourer, that is an excellent sort of season break.
We saw a screenshot. There's just like a 2-second clip of it in the trailer, but I saw somebody clip it out and post it on Twitter of the Not a Beholder monster, which in the trailer appears to be a single-eyed kind of orb-shaped monster, but it has like tentacles from its bottom that thrust into the ground as opposed to stalks on its head. That's just what we can gauge from the trailer. So
this is interesting just from the perspective of in the live show, they had previously encountered a beholder. And so by the time they encountered a beholder in this arc, it was not like the biggest deal in the world. It was something they'd done before, but I've only just remembered that in the show that's not true.
Well, the show has it like this was posted on Twitter and somebody was asking, they were like, oh, come on, surely Wizards can let them have the Beholder or let them have D&D monsters because it's basically the D&D show. But like you look at the tone of this and the sense of humor of this, and I'm like, I have no doubt why Wizards kind of don't want to tie this down as the D&D show with like butt jokes for days.
Even if Wizards were happy with it, I doubt Hasbro would be happy with it. Does that sound right, Shawn?
I have no idea what anyone is talking about, what anyone is thinking. I don't even know what I'm thinking at this point. I will say this. I will say two things. I am incredibly happy for those Critical Role fans who are getting to see this. The storyteller part of me, having lived through a time when we beloved books and saw them made into movies and went through all sorts of convoluted conversations about how is this translating over. This is one of the first times that I can think of where this new medium of streaming is now being turned into a different medium, and how the audience is accepting of this one medium, which is a very long show that you get to watch with your friends, often chatting at the same time, versus this very short, not necessarily watched with your friends sort of media. And that's very fascinating for me.
The thing I'm delighted about this particular jump from streaming to legacy media is is that the TV show isn't given the prestige priority. Critical Role is still the live stream first and foremost. That's the heart of what it is, which is just really interesting and actually very exciting to me. It's not like, ooh, Critical Role is now finally legit because it has an animated series. No, it's like they really wanted to do an animated series, and so they did it. But that's still a sort of ancillary way of consuming Critical Role.
The Legends of Vox Machina Season 2 hitting Amazon Prime in January 20, 2023. It's only about a month to go. In fact, almost a month to the day to wait for that. Speaking of Amazon Prime and things that may be appearing there, this is so tangentially D&D related, but it's kind of...
It's important to you.
It's important to me.
What matters.
In fact, it's barely even Witcher Watch related, but it's just hilarious that Henry Cavill comes out. He's like, I'm done with Geralt. I'm back as Superman. All right, I'm not back as Superman. And then just immediately goes into doing a Warhammer 40,000 TV show for Amazon Prime, which he will act in and executive produce. I'm back on board. I'm collecting Warhammer 40k again. I'm reclaiming my teenage hobby. Let's go. All right, Necrons all the way. Or Eldar or whatever they call them. Anyway, I just thought that was funny. Moving on.
I'm excited for you, Ben.
Oh, thanks.
I'm very happy for you.
Speaking of things that Shawn has no idea what I'm talking about. The news out of the way this week. We haven't done a lot of listener emails the last couple of episodes, so I thought I would just pack this one with as many listener emails as we can get through. I guess just the last tiny bit of Eldritch Lorecast specific news for those that are watching on Twitch at the moment is that this episode is our last streamed episode for the year. So we won't be live streaming the Eldritch Lorecast next week because we've already pre-recorded it, but on YouTube and the audio platforms, it will still be there on Wednesday, Thursday, depending on your time zone as normal. So we will still be around, but we won't be streaming it next week because next week we have the most prestigious of tabletop RPG industry awards, the number one tabletop RPG industry awards, you might say. The Ellie's, I think, is what we settled on. You'll have to tune in next week to find out.
This is terrible. This is bad.
Yeah, I have no idea what we talked about on those.
The name will be announced officially next week.
All I know for sure is we did not call it the Lorries.
All right, we did get quite a few emails in, so I'm going to start jumping through a few of those. This first one is kind of tangentially news-ish related, which is Raul's question. Raul asking about the featuring of the Goliath and the Ardling in the Unearthed Arcana playtests for 5.5, 6e, 1D&D, whatever they end up choosing to call it, and wondering if kind of two things, I think. First of all, does this mean that the Goliath and the Ardling are likely to appear in a player's handbook? Is the Goliath now a core species for 6e? But also pointing out that the Goliath is very, especially in the changes that we've seen to the species, is very tied into giants. And we know that we've got a giant book coming next year. And Ardlings seem to have a connection or could have a connection to Planescape. And we know we've got a Planescape book coming out late next year. So I guess the question being, with the big lineup that we know of next year, are we likely to see any of this playtest material that is currently being promoted as 1D&D material in 5th edition products before the official launch of 1D&D? Your thoughts?
I want to answer your question, the question you posed to us. Like, is this what they're doing? Is this what they're doing? Are they sort of faking us out with them being in one D&D and actually secretly playtesting a new product? My answer to that question is I don't care. But the more interesting question that I do care about, I don't mind if you care about it. If one of you can answer that question. What does really interest me, though, is if Goliaths are in the 6th edition Player's Handbook, that would mark a step, in my opinion, forward for D&D that takes it away from generic fantasy tropes that it itself popularized in the 70s and onward. If the Goliath, either replaces or stands next to the half-orc in the Player's Handbook as the big tough guy character, that is sort of a continuation of the sort of, how should I say it, the proprietarization of D&D that we started seeing in 4th edition with highly unique to D&D races like tieflings and dragonborn appearing in the Player's Handbook. Now, of course, there are devilkin and dragon-like humanoids and other fantasy properties, but there's something distinctly unique about D&D's dragonborn and tiefling. They have a highly sort of action figureizable look to them, and I think Goliaths do too. Even though they also kind of look like those aliens that were in the 3rd J.J. Abrams Star Trek movie.
But those aren't like those are kind of a little bit fluid, right? Like what a tiefling is, what a Goliath is, what a furbolg is, what a tiefling is, as we've discussed on this podcast before, have kind of changed from 4th edition into 5th edition, and even throughout 5th edition kind of influenced, even if it's not what's written in a book, people's perception of what that thing is. I think we've talked about...
classic example, the difference between how people perceive tieflings versus how they are described in the book. In the book, it's like various tones of flesh and red. That's the options that you have. Yeah. And then people are like, no, I think you'll find that mine is jewel blue. So...
And here's the thing about Goliaths is that if Critical Role had not had a Goliath in their main cast in 2014, I don't think we'd be having this Goliath-centric conversation at all. And that's the exact same thing for furbolgs and tieflings, two other races that highly pushed outside of D&D's very sort of branded look for them. Tieflings, as they are in 5e, started in 4th edition, just like Dragonborn, that incarnation, because they wanted to create some identity for these D&D unique creatures, and they stayed that way going into 5th edition. But Dragonborn aren't immune to this either, because Dragonborn are now starting to take on the look of what D&D calls half dragons. If you look at the Tyranny of Dragons adventure in the beginning of the edition, half dragons are the ones that have heads that look like chromatic dragons, right? A blue half dragon is basically a mini blue dragon head on a scaled humanoid body. Dragonborn they're all sort of bronzy, coppery scaled with these kind of tendrily looking scale hair bits that are very distinct from the way that chromatic metallic dragons look. But there have been a lot of Dragonborn character in Critical Role that kind of veer away from that D&D style look of Dragonborn too. We can see Critical Role driving the look and the interest of certain D&D species as they go into the future. I think that's incredibly interesting.
This was my thing with furbolgs as well, right? Is like furbolgs, I initially thought of them as kind of giant kin, right? And they're broad and they're large, and they're largely sort of humanoid looking, except for maybe a grayish tone to their skin or whatever. And
it looks like big Celts, basically.
Yeah. Well, no, exactly. And then they've kind of like further and further evolved into like bovine people, with like massive floppy ears and like elongated faces, to become more and more sort of anthropomorphized through iterations, which I think I to my perception was, again, because of Critical Role, because of I can't think of the character's name off the top of my head. Please, someone rescue me. Not who I was thinking of, but I'll take it.
You're
thinking of Caduceus Clay.
I'm thinking of Caduceus Clay, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I refused to say it because I don't think that that's how it's pronounced, but I also don't want to mispronounce the character's name, but that's fine.
Shawn, what are you thinking in all of this in terms of how Unearthed Arcana is functioning?
You go back to 1st edition days and you could play Right. Human, half elf, halfling, half orc, dwarf. That's about it. There might have been a couple others. And then they would introduce via Dragon Magazine or via the Unearthed Arcana when that book came out, some new options. And you would get half the player population that would be, yes, I can play something different. Go me. And the other half would be like, this isn't D&D. As soon as you introduce X into the game. So what we've seen over the years is this sort of, we'll introduce something new. We'll see how the fans react. If we think that the fans are enjoying it for the most part, we will continue to push it forward, evolve it as we go. If they don't like it, if we get too much of a pushback, it's just going to go by the wayside and we'll try it again later. What these playtest packets give them is the ability to not do the rules work, but do the people like it? What is the reaction? What is the upvote or downvote on the Ardling? We know people loved anthropomorphized characters. We also know that people hate anthropomorphized characters and don't want anything to do with them. So let's make an Ardling race where you can be anything you want. You can make your turtle, rabbit, weevil dude, and you're good to go. If they get some pushback, okay, we'll put it in the Planescape book because we have a perfect spot for them, in the Happy Hunting Grounds or Mount Celestia or wherever we're going to place them. And then we can leave them out of the player's handbook. If we get a 90% plus reaction from them in the packet, maybe they will go into the 6E player's handbook as a base species or background or whatever you want to call them. So I think the Wizards of the Coast and these packets are sort of having their cake and eating it too, because they are using this as a great way to get feedback. And the more corporate you get, the more you need numbers to prove the things that you're doing. So those numbers will become more and more and more important as we get further along in this iteration of 1D&D.
They're surveying the audience, but not in the ways you necessarily might think.
They come at you from the sides. Is this true? I have the vaguest concept in my mind that I feel like I must have picked up from somewhere. Is it true that in the earliest phases, that if you wanted to play an elf or a dwarf, that was like picking your class? Like, here's the fighter, here's the elf?
In OD&D, so even before basic, even before advanced, there was, your race was your class. So you could play a fighter, which you were human, or you could play a dwarf, which was a dwarf.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
This won't be the first time I brought it up, but there's a great, very anime-style D&D arcade brawler cabinet called Shadows over Mystara that has that in full effect. Look up the classes from Shadows over Mystara. There's Thief, Warrior, Paladin, Elf, Dwarf. And that's what D&D was like. These guys look like anime characters, but that's what D&D was like. There's sorry to go backward, but someone in chat is talking about the CRification, the bovinification of furbolgs by root of CR. It's a much more muddled topic than that, because furbolgs appeared in Volo's Guide to Monsters, right? And they had this already sort of animalized look to them. They had the ears weren't as floppy as they were, but they had this sort of animal-like look to them. They had this big red nose that kind of had a bovine look to it. And there were only 2 pieces of furbolg art, I think, to this day, from Wizards in all of 5e. There's that one piece of the furbolg in Volo's Guide. And when Dylan Sprouse played a furbolg on Force Grey, he got a piece of art that basically just looks like that art went through the taffy stretcher and got tall and thin. And so there's really there's one furbolg in 5e, and there's one of them that's short and stout, and there's one of them that's tall and thin. And they both kind of have this sort of proto look to them. Like they were a concept in the process of going somewhere. That I think what happened here is, Matt or Taliesin or whoever it was Matt talking about Pumat's Soul. That was the first cow-like Firbolg in Critical Role. Looks at that piece of art, because Matt read all those books before he got ridiculously busy, and was like, okay, how can I describe this piece of art in writing? It's kind of cow-like. And then Ariana Orner, who did all the art for Campaign 2, went and was like, oh, it's kind of cow-like humanoid. And it kind of got telephoned from that like one extremely limited bit of concept art from Volo's Guide into what Critical Role has kind of made into their Firbolg. And I'm interested to see how Wizards reacts to that now very popular characterization of the Firbolg, if and when they bring it into the future.
Well, same with the Tiefling. You know, what does a Tiefling look like in 6th when they release that player's handbook? But this topic kind of goes hand in glove, which is an expression one of my drama teachers used to say all the time, with another email that we got. Grokka Deadeye in the Twitch chat has said the whole Firbolg thing reminds them of how kobolds went from little sort of dog-headed, almost hobgoblin-like creatures to being little dragons. And now when you say kobold, I think most D&D players, if not most everybody through cultural osmosis, now thinks of little lizard dudes. This reminds me of an email. Scarlet Moth sent this in, who is also in the Twitch chat, but this was an email that they sent in, which said that they were looking for information on Gorgons, which is from Greek mythology. The Gorgons, Dael, correct me if I'm wrong, were 3 sisters. One of Medusa was one of them, and they were originally monsters. But in the 5th edition Monster Manual, Gorgons are these like metallic
a metal bull.
bulls, and a Medusa is an entirely different monster that is a species of monster as opposed to like an individual.
Which does come from, so there were 3 sisters. 2 of them were monsters, the Gorgons. And then the 3rd one was just normal. She was Medusa. And then she separately became a monster that was the Medusa that we are familiar with. But I don't know what kind of monsters the Gorgon sisters were. I don't recall them being bulls. I'm going to look this up on theoid.com.
I'm going to guess, and you can tell me if I'm wrong after you look it up or not, but I think they were sort of like not dissimilar to how Medusa appears with her serpent hair, but I think they had wings and they kind of looked kind of gargoyle-ish.
The Greek standard is there were a lot of snakes on it. Yeah.
But they like snakes, like Lovecraft, like tentacles, the original Lovecraftian tentacles.
While Dael is looking this up, I want to totally on the side. Shawn, I'll leave the big, cool Wes Schneider piece to you because I've been talking a lot.
You do it. You do it.
Fine by me. Before I go there, I want to talk about a weird little hiccup that happened in Wizards with regards to Medusas and Gorgons this edition, because Magic the Gathering rightly calls their snake-headed monstrosities that can petrify you Gorgons. And so when some Gorgons from Magic the Gathering's Ravnica setting were brought into D&D via Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, much like the way Magic handles demons, which is different from D&D, there was some noun confusion that went on in that process. And I'm not a big enough Magic fan. I haven't read Ravnica in many, many years to really say how it ended up turning out. But I think there was some silliness that happened behind the scenes to make it work. Anyway, Dael, have you found out what kind of monsters the other Gorgon sisters are?
Yeah, the only description that I'm really getting here is that they were winged demons. So there probably were some snakes involved. Demons often had snakes, but I cannot confirm nor deny the presence of snakes, but definitely winged monsters that were not metal bulls.
Wes Schneider, who was once a senior designer on the Pathfinder team at Paizo and is now a senior designer on the D&D team at Wizards, once talked about many potential origins for the Gorgon, the metal bull that can breathe petrifying gas in D&D. This is a monster that dates back to some of the earliest Gary Gygax texts on D&D. And he, in this bit of scholarship talks about several different options. There are many creatures of myth that are four-legged beasts that have noxious breath, that are, inhospitable to humanity, things like the Catoblepas. But he goes on to say that creatures like that also were included in the original D&D monster manuals. So those can't necessarily be our answer. So where did Gygax get this strange metallic bull? And he talks about the way that early D&D writers in a pre-Wikipedia, pre-Google, pre-internet age had to learn this information. And generally it was through the library. It was through primary sources that are these days, fairly obscure on the internet, but might be less obscure in your own library catalog. And he specifically calls upon a 17th century zoological text by Edward Topsell called The History of Four-Footed Beasts. And Dante has promised me that I can screen share and it won't destroy everything. So I'm going to screen share.
Everybody hold
Brace
on.
for impact, everyone. This is the cover of Edward Topsell's The History of Four-Footed Beasts. And right here on the front, we can actually see Gary Gygax's scaled cow-like gorgon in a very early form.
I have no idea if the Twitch chat can see that. Oh, yes, they can.
I sure hope Twitch can.
Yes, they can. All right, I just looked. They can see it.
Excellent. And here is the text. This is essentially a medieval bestiary. This English guy, Edward Topsell, vastly overestimating his worldliness, talking about creatures that he has seen, maybe, heard about, definitely, and invented undeniably, to create a sort of strange mishmash of actual zoology, sort of mythological reinterpretation, and pure fiction, as people of the 16th century, 17th century were wont to do. And here's the text specifically on the Gorgon itself. It is a fearful and terrible beast to behold. It hath high and thick eyelids, eyes not very great, but much like an ox or a bugles, all fiery blowdy, which neither look directly forward nor yet upwards, but continually down to the earth, and therefore are called in Greek Catobleponta. There's a Catoblepas from before. From the crown of their head down to their nose, they have a long hanging mane, which maketh them to look fearfully. It eateth deadly and poisonful herbs, and if at any time he see a bull or other creature whereof he is afraid, he presently causeth his mane to stand upright, and being so lifted up, opening his lips and gaping wide, sendeth forth of his throat a certain sharp and horrible breath, which infecteth and poisoneth the air above his head, so that all living creatures which draw in the breath of that air are grievously afflicted thereby, losing both voice and sight, they fall into lethal and deadly convulsions. So this is not precisely the creature that Gary Gygax describes in the Monster Manual, but the bull appears here. The Gorgon, there's a little bit more text in Wes's post. The name Gorgon isn't mentioned here, but it's talked about elsewhere. That calls into shape a sort of a creature of fiction that has been processed and refictionalized through the lens of Gary Gygax into the Gorgon that appears in the Monster Manual.
You know what's so interesting about that to me is that I have, any number of times encountered a friend or someone who knows about a mythological creature from the Monster Manual, from D&D, from Pathfinder's Bestiaries, whatever, and they'll very confidently talk about what is a manticore, and they'll be very wrong about it usually, and having to have that conversation. But I'm now very aware that I too have fallen prey to it, because I've looked at the Gorgon and I've been like, what is this metal bull that breathes out poison fumes? I'm familiar with the Catoblepas, with this armored bull-like creature that breathes poisonous fumes. And it never even occurred to me that that's what this could be. But now that you've pointed it out, I'm suddenly very aware.
Yeah. The guy who writes this insists that the creature is known as the Libyan beast or the Gorgon in a separate part of that passage. And so, yeah, even though Gygax had already D&Dified the Catoblepas in the original Monster Manual, he just like, we'll double down. We'll do
I
another
wonder
one.
if it's also getting merged with the Karkadan, right? Which is sort of this I believe, Libyan, unicorn-like creature that is very reminiscent of a rhino, right? It's very possibly based on a rhino, but it's like a bull with one horn out of its nose, and it does these things, and it's terrible and fearsome.
I mean, that's what's so fascinating about mythology. I think the more that we've been talking about this sort of stuff on this podcast over the last 12 months, the more I have a growing appreciation of the way that mythology forms and iterates and changes, because we think of all that as like happening, back in ye olden times when they were oral traditions only, and that today, because everything's so written down and so available through the internet, there is one version of how everything happened. There is the Star Wars, the canon, there is the D&D monsters.
I have a lecture about this, Ben.
So it's just fascinating to me. Like, I did a version of a Darkling in a video recently, and predictably, but not incorrectly, somebody commented and said there's already a Darkling in Volo's Guide to Monsters, or it would be in Monsters of the Multiverse now. And I was like, yeah, but I don't like that version. Yeah, that doesn't speak to me. I think this is what a Darkling is, as I posited it in Grimhollow, as opposed to what the Darkling lore is, which is fairly tied into, if not the Forgotten Realms, kind of some other D&D kind of mythology. And it's part of what I love about going in for the double dip this week, dive in, the way that The Witcher presents its monsters as myths within its own world. And yet there are facts behind those myths that, like, this very specific cast of warriors knows the information about. And it's got, it's that advice that's given to GMs a lot about, like, how do I present a vampire if, like, the players already know everything about vampire mythology? It's like, well, play with the mythology. They assume their characters have heard all of these same myths, but what is true in your world and your version of the story might mess with them a little bit to gain that mythological feeling to your monsters that, like, forbiddance doesn't exist, and the vampire gets that awesome moment of just giving a light grin and stepping across the threshold, or forbiddance does exist, but some other, maybe sunlight sensitivity is not a thing in your campaign world. So you just see this a lot, with kobolds, with gorgons, with there's a bunch of other D&D monsters that, like, are completely not representative of how they appeared in their early mythology, but we continue to iterate just as our ancestors did with oral traditions in our modern storytelling. I feel like this has been a collective TED Talk right here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I didn't prepare a PowerPoint slide like James did, but
speaking of the kobold, I think it's very interesting their origin, because I think this one is a little bit better known than the weirdo Gorgon we deep dived on. But kobold it's a German monster. It's a German goblin, essentially, that were known for being miners. You've seen, World of Warcraft's kobolds, for example. They're all miners. They wear candles on their head and they labor in their own mines. And they were supposedly mining cobalt, etymologically related, the blue mineral. And so it's always kind of surprised me in 5e that D&D skewed red scaled with their kobold, when it's right there to skew them blue and be like, oh yeah, there they are. There's our little cobalt guys.
Cool.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Excellent.
It's almost like we're making things up here. in this game, in this world, in this life. This gets back to gaming, right? That you can do anything you want in your game, and you should do anything you want in your game, because we talk about the Medusa, and we talk about vampires, we talk about gorgons, and it goes back to canon that we've been talking about, right? None of this really exists It exists in our imaginations, in our history, but it does not exist in our real world. And so we can do what we want with it. We can make our own stories with it. And we should revel in that rather than confining ourselves or forcing our way of telling stories on someone else.
Get postmodern with it.
D&D already got postmodern with it in 1970s, so you have plenty of permission to do it now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's sort of the anti-canon movement, right? I think in discussions and debates online, there's a real desire to not come across like an idiot by accident, and not and be right about something and feel knowledgeable, right? So it's that whole, I've talked about it on the Lorecast before, that whole debate about, well, actually a dragon's got 4 legs and a wyvern has only 2 legs and a worm, blah, 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 blah. And it's kind of like, you know, what we do, I don't know whether to make a distinction between what we do now and what they were doing with the Greek myths, with the North myths. I think the difference there is that there was an element of actual belief, right? But at the same time, as I'm sure Euripides and these Greek playwrights were doing their versions of Medea or the Bacchae or something like that, they were just like, oh, well, this doesn't really, or there's a gap here in my story.
Yeah, this doesn't.
I'm just going to make something up.
This doesn't do what I want it to do.
Yeah,
Let's
I'm just going to
shift it.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's not any more special. It's just that those stories have lasted for so long, which is what makes them special.
This conversation makes me so happy. This is exactly what I get invited to speak for the history department about mythology, and then I do this like rebellious English lit thing about how there is no such thing as the original, and even if there was, why do we value it more than new iterations of stories?
Yeah, for sure.
And they keep inviting you back?
I don't know if they entirely know what I say.
Man, Shawn just this is the first time I've seen him take a swing at someone else. All right.
No, I'm taking a swing at English professors, of which I am kind of one. So I'm taking a swing at myself.
That's in character with Shawn.
Yeah, okay, all right.
That's the Shawn we know.
Yeah. All right, speaking of the Shawn we know, someone else who knows Shawn through this podcast is David. David sent an email to podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. And David's email wasn't very long. It was a single line. He linked us to a video from DM's Lair, which was going on a little bit of a disagreement with the way that Wizards of the Coast are currently providing more and more material, not just through the Unearthed Arcana for 1 D&D, but also through releases like Dragonlance or Tashes. I think Dragonlance was specifically called out. Providing power creep to players, providing like subclasses that just get stronger and stronger and stronger and have more outlandish abilities, making it harder for game masters to balance their game. And providing very little tools to dungeon masters to be able to do so, providing few monster revisions or few, iterations on monsters. We don't have a new vampire spawn that's updated to keep up with the power creep of the cleric, for example. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. Some of this is my words and not necessarily DM Lair's words for the record. I might share a link actually to the video in the chat so people can check it out for themselves. I think this is a bit of an overstated problem, but I want to know what you think.
Yeah, I watched the video and Luke got really fired up. I was enjoying it. He was going to town. What I say to him and to all the other people that talk about power creep is, welcome to the family, my friend. Go back to the earliest missives written into Dungeon or Dragon magazine complaining about the latest monster that's come out or the latest player option that's in their magazine and how horrible it is and how it's going to destroy the game. So is power creep a problem? Absolutely. Is it a problem that can't be overcome? Depends on who you are. It's not a problem for many DMs because many DMs know who their players are and they know how to make the changes to their adventures and their monsters in order to compensate and still present a fun game to their players. If your players are feeling like they are having it too easy, but they're not going to stop taking the most optimized options, then you as the DM can just present harder monsters, more hit points, hits a little harder, roll an extra die for damage. You can do that. when do we start seeing real problems with the power creep? It's when you have people who are playing at the same table who you can't hide. You can hide story things from players. You can't hide numbers from them. So a player is going to know if this player rolls their damage and says, I do 72 points of damage, and the other player rolls their die and says, I do 5 points of damage. That's not something you as the DM can just gloss over. That's not something that you can fix from behind the screen. So that's where Wizards of the Coast needs to take a more active, level-headed approach to making sure that those things don't happen as much. It's also a problem if you run published adventures and you expect the published adventure to be able to handle the players at your table without you doing a lot of work to fix it. So in those areas, yes, it is definitely a problem. But as Luke in the video says, Wizards needs to sell books. And players are not going to buy books if the things that are put into the books are perceived to be weaker than the things that were already out there. So there needs to be a little power creep to entice players, especially those who are looking to find the optimal solutions to the problems that they perceive that their characters will come across in the game, to give them something to enjoy in this hobby.
Yeah. Sorry, go. No, I was just.
And the last thing I was going to say was Wizards did try to fix monsters. They tried it in the book called Monsters of the Multiverse, right? Is that the name of the book? I believe.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So that's what they're doing there, right? They're trying to fix the math, not necessarily from power creep, but just from overall miscalculations at the start of the game, plus the power creep that's come since.
Right. And I mean, of course, Tasha's as well tried to address some of the power differences between players' handbook classes and classes that had come since then as well. I think the thing that is the alternative, right? Like, because I completely agree with Shawn. I don't think that the problem lies in the more powerful classes themselves. I think it lies in the fact that you're going to have people who still think that being a ranger with a bear for a companion sounds really cool and they want to play that. And if they're playing that alongside your Gloomstalker, it starts to become really obvious that there is a difference there in how powerful the design is. But there is the valuable difference in that as D&D, as Wizards of the Coast are designing new classes, they don't have to necessarily actually make the classes more powerful because they have the benefit of different concepts, different themes. And if they committed to making each new theme for a subclass less broad, perhaps, then you get a lot more room to be like, this is our bard that does specifically this one thing. This is our bard that does this. But it's tricky when your player's handbook bards are, this is the one that's really good at magic. This is the one that's really good at fighting. You know what I mean? Like you get some of these early subclasses that are much broader. And so once you start pulling in those narrower concepts, you not only have to make sure that your concept isn't retreading ground, you also have to give them a little something. Because if the concept is just, okay, this is a spellcasting focused bard, but it's got this theme about it, you also need to make it a little bit more powerful because they could just do that with the lore bard, you know? But I think that there is a lot of room there for them to pull back on the power creep. Power creep worries me. It worries me. I see it happen and I feel bad for the player's handbook subclasses because I think they could have been cooler than they were.
I think the thing is that 5e, speaking for myself, I find it when in designing the Monster Hunter and sometimes even in designing monsters, it's hard to design for sometimes, I think because maybe the maths is so bounded to that D20, you can't go too crazy with what modifiers are. Otherwise, it's just like, oh, it's going to hit most things or probably won't hit most things, or it might be 50-50 depending on what the AC is. But also because so much of the game is kind of hand-waved in a way to make it open and accessible for folks, it's hard to give abilities that address a problem that isn't already being addressed by some sort of hand wave or isn't overpowered or is doing anything whatsoever to benefit the player. How often should a subclass be able to recharge their abilities to be their cool thing to be able to use it again without it kind of becoming this weird runaway train. And in fact, I found, speaking of Volos, Xanathars, more so than Tashas, I found a lot of the subclasses in Xanathars to actually be kind of underpowered. And I know that book's a few years old now, so maybe it's not really relevant anymore to the power creep that's happened since. But yeah, I suppose the thesis point of what I'm saying is that it can be hard to design for 5e with an ability that does something that isn't already being covered by something else that isn't, powered up in some way.
Well, hey, you want to talk a book that provided broadly underpowered options and see how well they're remembered. Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide.
Yeah.
A book with maybe the exception of the Blade Singer is remembered largely for its cantrips. Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade, which were so popular they were reprinted in Tasha's, rather than its Way of the Long Death Monk, the Cormyrean Purple Dragon Knight Fighter, the Oath of the Crown Paladin. You ever heard of these guys?
Stop making things up, James. Stop making things up. You're just saying words now.
I will say though, Oath of the Crown Paladin is in my upcoming campaign. Someone did pick it, so
hell yeah. I'm glad because I do like the Oath of the Crown. I like some of these subclasses, but like Sun Soul Monk, these are very forgettable subclasses, largely because even with the cool theme they had to go along with them, generally they just did not have the mechanical oomph to back it up, and so they were lost to time. No one talks about them anymore. And this kind of gets me into the place where, as a game designer, I want to be very precise with my wording because I don't want to imply that it's the role of the game master to clean up after us. The role of the game designer is to do good game design, and good game design often includes making classes that are within a certain balance curve. And you're not doing very well at your job if you completely blow out the balance curve in one way or the other. However, it is a lot more possible to balance things very, very tightly in a game with fewer moving parts than D&D. We can have a perfectly balanced game of D&D in a game like 4th edition, where the power curves are much more parallel. In a game that's as asymmetric as D&D is, the asymmetry is a part of the fun, and that gets us kind of away from our goal of balance as well. You can go play chess if you want symmetric balance. And so when it comes to players wiping the floor with monsters, that generally doesn't bother me. Make the monsters stronger. You've got a nice little lever as a GM to ratchet that up. If a player character is lagging behind, or one player character is absolutely roaring to the front and decimating everything, the GM has one really, really powerful tool to nip that sort of thing in the bud. And it starts with a session 0. It starts with, like an adult, talking with your players about the problem and not trying to find a sort of sneaky mechanical trick to solve the problem without any of the awkward friction of talking about your problems with your friends. I'm being a bit flip here, but it's uncomfortable. It's legitimately uncomfortable. But if you push through it, you can raise solutions like, hey, there's one player character who is not much of a power gamer optimizer. Is this a problem for you, one player? And if the player says, no, I'm fine, then you have no problem. If the player says, yeah, it kind of sucks all the time when I basically can't contribute in combat, just, look to the rest of your players, say something like, okay, I'd love to give this player a really kick-ass magic item to bring their power curve up to the rest of the team. We all okay with that? No one's going to feel left out if I don't give you a really cool magic item to bring this guy kind of back into the power curve. And I think if your players aren't jerks, they will have a sort of respect for the social contract at play here, which is like, yeah, we want a friend to have fun with us. Yeah. And if they are, a little bit more negotiation, a little bit more discussion, I have faith that in an issue of inter-party balance like this, you will be able to find a solution that makes people happy.
Well, I mean, it's like I've said it before, I'll say it a million times again. I think that balance is less about the mats. I think the mats plays a role in it, but it ultimately comes down to, is the fun balanced, right? because you can have this asymmetrical mats throughout the system. But as long as this player who wanted to play a ranger with a pet bear is having fun with their pet bear, as long as they have the fun toys to play with that they want to play with, then it doesn't matter necessarily if they're doing as much damage or, succeeding in as many skill checks or whatever as X other party member who has their own fun toys. Everyone just needs to have their fun toys to play with. And that's what it ultimately is going to come down to, particularly when we're talking about like that thing that I brought up before, that thing of the concept. What is the fantasy that this player wants to play into? Do they have the tools to achieve that? And that's where you achieve balance, in my opinion, rather than, worrying too much about the exact level of power creep.
And what the game then needs to do is admit that it needs help in striking that balance. It needs to admit that you, the dungeon master, are able to fix some of the problems that will be found in this game because it is a complex machine. And it needs to admit it and then give coping techniques for DMs that find themselves in these situations. But in order to do that, you have to admit that this machine you're making is not perfect. And that's a hard thing to do for people who have put their whole life and heart and soul and 80 hours a week and nightmares into a game that they're making.
Here's a good comparison, I think, because I kind of live in fear of saying things like this, like, oh, the game designers can't be perfect. They can't design a perfect game, because there are people who really get on game designers' butts about this. They're really nasty on the internet. And I'm like, look at a trumpet. A trumpet is an instrument that through blowing air into it at certain frequencies of vibration of your lips and pressing down levers or pressing down pads, you produce different notes, right? However, a trumpet can fall out of tune based on conditions outside of the player's control, outside the player's own skill. Skill has nothing to do with it. The trumpet can simply fall out of tune. If it's too hot, if it's too cold, the brass will expand and contract. And trumpets are built with a tuning slide, a little slide in that shrinks or extends the length of the piping that will help put it back into tune. And that's put there by design. That's good design by a trumpet maker to put that slide in there so that the person who's playing it can make more specific their experience with the trumpet. And that's the sort of thing we're talking about with the game. It's good design to include ways for the DM to tune the game.
I think a trumpet's a good analogy as well, because trumpets are ungodly nightmares of different length tubes just kind of coming in and out of the valves. And it's just like, how did the person who invented the trumpet decide on how long this tube was as opposed to this tube over here and this one over here? And don't even get me started on tubers.
Yeah, get those tubers out of here. Really briefly, I did want to say, it's interesting to me that we have focused so much on power creep as it comes to class design and subclasses, when I feel like sitting right there, not mentioned so far, is the power creep that we've seen in racial traits. Like you go from player's handbook racial traits that are like, you're resistant to poison and you know about rocks. And then now we're at the point where everyone is like, okay, this is a cantrip you get at this level. At 3rd level, you learn this other spell. At 5th level, it turns into another spell. And it just becomes this, like, everyone's a spellcaster. Everyone's got extra goodies in their little Santa sacks. And the poor early days dwarves are sitting there like, what?
Well, they get fairly good ability score buffs even under the Tasha's rules, because of the way that worked. It was like they get their better buffs.
It's maybe just fewer bells and whistles. And I'm not saying that I prefer the spell system. I said it either. I don't know whether it was in the future or in the past at this point. In one of the episodes, I did or will talk about my annoyance with spells being chucked on as racial traits. But yeah. It is one of those things where I feel like racial traits have gotten just exponentially more powerful the more have been invented.
I think that was in the past because I think that was the episode where we talked about the packet I think that was 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
it was the
that was
episode
with Luna. Okay.
Yeah,
2
with
weeks
Luna.
ago was the
Gotcha.
future, Ben,
Packet.
wasn't it?
Yeah.
Or was that actually the past?
No, that was 2 weeks ago as well when we pre-recorded. I mean, my problem with that isn't so much that like there's a power creep there, but there is a thematic creep of, races, species becoming more and more magical innately, where it goes from like, yes, I have great knowledge of rocks because I've lived in and among mountains my entire life to like, I am a rock in human form and I will, shape shift or like command the rocks to do as I wish.
Although conceptually that sounds badass.
Yeah, fair.
I love that version of dwarves suddenly.
Just imagining May from Overwatch. Overwatch 1, for the record, I don't know if she's into or changed, but just like turns into a little ice cube. It's just dwarf can run along and then into a little rock that slides a little bit further along the ground. Anyway, speaking of rocks that slide along the ground, this podcast needs to stop sliding because we're out of time. So, as I mentioned before, we packed this episode filled with emails. If you want to email us for next year, the email address is podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. I know next year feels like it's in the misty distance, but I bank all of the emails that I receive and I try to get around to most of them as often as possible. So if you send one this year, I'll bank it for next year. As I mentioned, we won't be streaming next week or the week after. Our next streaming date will be the 9th or the 10th, depending on whether you're on, US time or Australia time, or wherever else in the world you happen to be. As far as I'm aware, it will be the 9th, 7:30 Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. is what I meant to say. Oh, it's going so good. It's starting to fall apart. All right. We'll be streaming on the 9th, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on the 10th at 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. And in the meanwhile, I hope you enjoy the 2 episodes we have coming in the next 2 weeks because they were something.
Did everyone get that? Ben, you want to repeat that one more time just in case they didn't hear?
I don't. I'm sorry for shouting, everyone. It's been a long year.
Da, 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 da.